Our next presenter is Cam Lawrence, who goes by the Twitter handle @Moneypuck. Cam Lawrence is a born and raised Vancouverite and a lifelong Canucks fan. In his career as a chartered professional accountant, he has spent over a decade helping businesses in the high-tech and biotech sectors achieve improved results through data-driven decision-making. He employs those same principles to the business of hockey as an author on CanucksArmy.com. Cam Lawrence.
Thanks everyone for having me today. Really appreciate it. Hard act to follow. Micah was excellent. That was awesome. So the project I'm going to talk to you about today is completely different than most of the stuff we talked about earlier. It's really focusing on evaluating prospects outside of the NHL, which has a whole host of challenges associated with it. This snippet is really the current status of a long-term project I've been working with Josh Weisbach on. He's another Canucks Army author and the founder of CHLstats.com. So challenges associated with this project. Really, I mean, we've come a long way in terms of stats that are in the NHL itself. A lot of those stats really don't hold true, aren't accessible outside of the NHL. So really we're stuck with games played, goals, assists, points, penalty minutes. And beyond that, it's really across a real broad set of feeder leagues. Over 20 plus feeder leagues are evaluated in this study. So that has its own host of problems. Specifically, the quality of the leagues themselves can vary dramatically. We use Rob Bowman's NHL equivalencies to get a sense on the various different strengths within across the various leagues. But also, even beyond that, as fans, we've become accustomed to a certain level of parity in the NHL over the last decade or so. That really doesn't exist in other leagues. For instance, in the OHL or the CHL leagues, you'll often see teams vary from 2 goals a game to 5 goals a game based on how stacked that any particular team is for the Memorial Cup run. So Guelph last year, and Sault Ste. Marie this year are absolute powerhouses. So when you're evaluating prospects from those teams, you have to take into account the impact their line mates have. As we've seen in the NHL, quality of teammates is a really important factor. What we do know, and we've drawn some of this out with work very recently actually, is points per game is obviously a very meaningful metric, as is the age of a player. I don't mean 17 versus 18. I mean a March birthday versus a September birthday can have an impact on their likelihood of success when you take their point production into account. But also, most recently, we've been doing some work on height. And this is around a discussion that's been in the stats community for a while. It's been around this concept that teams have a tendency to pick larger, unskilled players over skilled, small players. So really we wanted to flesh that out. And what we found, actually Garrett Hole, another author in the Nations Network, used our data set to do a regression. He found that it was actually statistically significant for height to be a prediction of future success in terms of NHL points per game. But again, we have issues with that in terms of whether that's a true effect of bigger players being more successful, or is that an impact of teams have a tendency to select those players higher and invest more in their development, thus leading to their improved production. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. We still have to flesh out, but as it sits now, the data that I'll get into later really does show if all else is equal, they score at the same rate in the same or similar league, you should pick the player that's a bit bigger because they have a higher likelihood of success, at least as we've seen in this data set that I'll get to shortly. Again, the quality of the leagues is also an important factor. What we look at is, especially when it comes to the European elite leagues, if you're a 17-year-old playing in the Swedish Hockey League, for instance, you probably got there because you're pretty good, because it's a pretty good league. So those players had a much higher correlation with successful NHL careers than did their peers playing in the CHL. So lots of interesting stuff as we look across the leagues. So this project specifically, there has been some work across the various junior leagues, but what we wanted to do in this is look across all the relevant feeder leagues. So over a long period of time. So Josh worked with me to scrape data from elite prospects over a period going back to 1988, 89, all the way through to the present. So what we did is we split the data into two sets. A data we used to predict future results, which was from 88 through 2004. And then we used the key attributes we found in the regression. So that's the size of a player, their point production, and the same or similar league. And what we did is we broke that down into groups of players with those similar attributes, and then looked how that cohort of players did in terms of future NHL success. So to get into that in a little bit more depth, here's a snapshot of the data set that we worked with. So the CHL leagues were put together. It's a 3,600 17-year-old seasons. We did the same thing with the Junior A in Canada. We did the same thing with the NCAA Div 1 schools, the Euro Elite Leagues, the Euro Junior Leagues, as well as the Junior Leagues in the U.S. So it's a pretty large data set, 7,300 17-year-old seasons. We excluded goalies. We excluded everyone that played less than 10 games. We excluded the U.S. high school system because I had issues with completeness of that data set for obvious reasons, and as well as the second division leagues in Europe, because we found there was this lower correlation, which indicated, we think, the fact that the best players were playing either at the first division elite leagues or in their junior system. So over a 15-year period, accumulated data from 7,300 players. What we did is we started to break up the comparable features, and this is the height distribution of players in the NHL last year. So what you see is the average, this is defensive and forwards grouped together, but the average is around 6 feet. The standard deviation takes you on one side from 5'9" to 6 feet, the other side from 6 feet to 6'3", and then the tails on either end. So we split those players into one of those four buckets, forwards and defense split separately. And then we group them into what I call cohort heat maps. So on the y-axis going down, we see point production increasing from 0 to over 1.25 points per game for forwards, and then the bars for defensemen are 0 to 2.25 down to over 7.75 on defense. So as you go from top to bottom, you're scoring more. As you go from left to right, you're getting taller. So this actually was really interesting for us. Because as we see, this is your smaller forward who scores a lot, makes it into the NHL just over 1 out of 3 times in this data set spanning 15 years. So that was kind of interesting, but as you get taller, it goes all the way to 87%. So that's your draft watcher this year. That's your Dylan Strome over here, the big guy that scores a lot. And then we saw the same effect on defensemen. It was even more pronounced. So this is your Aaron Ekblad, your Alex Pietrangelo. So the big defenseman that everyone wants that goes first overall, yeah, they generally turn out to be pretty good NHL players. So we performed this type of analysis. We did it for all of those 20 plus different feeder leagues, and used these cohort percentage of success results and applied them to data from the players going into the 2005 through 09 drafts, to see how this actually lined up as potentially predictive of future success. Now, this is the second data set I was talking about. This is 2005 through 2009. What we're seeing here is the number of players that were included in the population that we looked at. So roughly, there's 3.5 times more players that we looked at in total versus the players that were actually drafted. So it's a pretty big data set. Same exclusions we talked about before, no goalies, only 17-year-olds, they had to play 10 games. The only thing that's different from before is I excluded KHL players, because I found there was a lot of highly talented KHL players who weren't getting drafted, and I didn't think that would be good with the overall data set, because I think there's a reason beyond necessarily the skill of the players in factor there. It was a little enigmatic kind of results. So correlation of results. On the left side, this is the predicted success rate. So I took all the percentages of the bands. So say you were in the 30 to 40% band. There's a number of players that hit that band. in terms of the players within that predicted band that actually hit 100 games, that's 28%. So what we see on the predicted side on the left, the actual side on the right, is that they line up almost perfectly. So the players, if we look at a pool of players, if I give you a list of 10 names and say this pool of players of 10 names has a 50% chance of making it, more cases than not, 5 out of 10 of them did. So I think this is where the nexus point is between where the quantitative stuff can actually work really well with the qualitative scouting, because if I'm able to identify this list of names for you, and then the scouts can layer in their qualitative analysis to tell you which of those 10 names are the 5 that will make it, I think it could be a pretty powerful way to look at the game, or at least keep them honest. And to keep them honest point, there's a ton of players in the 0 to 5 or the 5 to 10 range that get drafted every single year. So when you have a group and you can say, look, this pool of players that are most comparable to this guy that you want to pick only make it 1 out of 20 times. So why is this guy the guy that's going to make it 1 out of 20 times? So I think it's a helpful tool. And in terms of overall correlation with the model, we found predicted cohort percentage of success correlated at a 0.497 rate with NHL points per game. And we also did a second metric, which was taking their league points per game, applying the NHL equivalency rates to do call it an NHL equivalency adjusted points per game, and that had a pretty good correlation as well at 0.48. So two interesting tools to work with. As I went through a redraft process on the next slide. So I didn't get through all 30 teams, Micah, but ran out of time. We did 12, and so I did 2 tests. My first test was look at, for the teams that I redrafted, look at the next 15 highest players ranked by CSS, and take the highest predicted percentage success rate there and select the player that way. The second one was to take the highest points per predicted, which one is this? The highest adjusted points per game player, and then pick the highest percentage of success rate from that pool. What I found was overall the actual teams outdrafted in terms of games played, but then my second test, which is the marriage of net NHL adjusted points per game and percentage of success, that had a significantly better job in terms of drafting players that scored better. So that was a result that we were really quite interested in. We actually drafted 10 out of 12 teams in terms of point production with that method. There's some reasons for that. Specifically, no goalies were picked, so that impacts your number of games played and points per game, obviously, as well as the preference for higher scoring forwards. So, there's some issues with this data for sure. The edge cases, the difference between 1.24 points per game in one cohort and 1.25 in another, has some issues with edge cases. That said, so we're looking at more elegant statistical models to do this going forward. But in terms of, and there's also the issues with players in various cohorts. So you might have a lot of Colton Orrs in a cohort, but that doesn't happen as much as you may expect. So by and large, I think this is a pretty good example here on the bottom. In 2007, the top 3 percentage of success ranked defensemen were Alex Plant, who went 15 overall. He was a bust for the Oilers, but he probably would have been a bust for 29 other teams because his underlying metrics were great and his scouting rankings were great. So they just were the ones that got unlucky there. The next was a guy, Jervalach. He never was drafted, actually. He had great underlying numbers, and he went on to play an excellent career in the top European elite league. So he's quite kind of the example of a guy that probably might have been a replacement level player if given a shot. And then the third one, of course, is PK Subban, who's had a pretty decent NHL career so far. So yeah, I think for the tool, this process of quantitatively looking at who that group of players who a player most directly compares to historically has a lot of merit. And then if we can identify which of these 3 is going to be the actual NHLer, then all the better. But at the very least, it's it's interesting results for future work. So as I said, the next stage is really looking at more elegant statistical models to recreate this a little bit more elegantly. And then more of a database approach so we can run multiple simulations. And then including more metrics that we find interesting, so stuff like quality of teammates into the model and a few other things. But by and large, I think we when we see the draft specials and they say this guy's going to be the next, Ryan Getzlaf or Alex Ovechkin, we all scoff. But what we've tried to do here is, okay, like let's look at that player. Let's look at the 30 or 40 or 50 guys most consistently like this guy, and then see what we can learn about that broader cohort. And we found that by doing that type of analysis, we've actually come across some pretty interesting predictive results. Thank you.